Imagine trying to negotiate this massive corporate merger with a rival CEO on a Tuesday, right?
Right.
But then while you're doing that, you're actively deploying warships to block their subsidiary supply lines on a Wednesday.
Yeah, exactly.
You're sitting across the boardroom table finalizing a joint venture, and you're fully aware that outside the building, your security teams are literally locked in a physical standoff.
It sounds completely impossible.
It is. But that is exactly the deeply contradictory diplomatic tightrope that the United States is walking on the global stage right now. So welcome to the Steep Dive.
Glad to be here for this one.
Yeah, today we are taking a magnifying glass to a really detailed, extremely wide-ranging press gaggle transcript featuring Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And our mission today for you, the listener, is to extract the raw facts of the current U.S. foreign policy landscape.
Right. We're unpacking exactly how the U.S. attempts to balance these massive geopolitical rivalries, intense regional proxy conflicts, and, its own sprawling internal bureaucratic machinery.
Exactly. But before we get into the mechanics of how that balancing act actually works, or I guess fails to work, we need to set some strict parameters for what we're doing today.
Yeah, that's super important because, by its very nature as a high-level government briefing, this source material contains some really politically charged content.
Oh, absolutely.
It references different administrations, varying systems of government, deeply entrenched ideological conflicts. So our purpose here is strictly analytical.
Right. We are mapping out the chessboard exactly as it was described in the specific briefing.
Exactly. Analyzing the policies, the strategies, the underlying logic presented in the text. We are not here to endorse any specific viewpoint or ideology. We are simply examining the architecture of the arguments.
Well said. We're looking at the blueprint of American foreign policy as it stands in this document, and let me tell you, it is a deeply complicated blueprint.
Oh, it really is.
We're going to explore everything from the game theory of modern nuclear negotiations to the mechanics of international oil smuggling, all the way down to the granular details of how the U.S. government organizes its own staff.
But to understand any of this, you really have to recognize that foreign policy is no longer about isolated incidents.
Right.
The overarching theme of this entire transcript is deep, unavoidable interconnectedness. Like a disrupted waterway in the Middle East directly dictates the availability of Asian energy supplies.
And then those constrained energy supplies fundamentally alter the leverage in superpower negotiations happening, thousands of miles away in Washington or Beijing.
Right. It is a closed-loop system.
Yeah.
Every action forces a reaction across multiple distinct domains. And the relationship that generates the most friction in that system, the dynamic that dictates the baseline temperature for the rest of the globe, is a relationship between the United States and China.
Yeah, so the briefing actually begins by addressing a notably long meeting with the Chinese counterpart, Wang Yi. And the text notes that while some of the length was just, the logistics of diplomatic translation, the primary explicit goal of the U.S. strategy right now is laying the groundwork for a positive visit by President Xi to Washington in September.
They are really searching for concrete deliverables. The text specifically mentions pushing for things like a Board of Trade and Investment.
But wait, how does a Board of Trade and Investment actually function when you have two nations that are simultaneously treating each other as primary adversaries?
It's a great question.
The text explicitly points out that the administration acknowledges there are great differences that will exist for the foreseeable future. They aren't trying to solve the ideological conflict. They're just trying to manage it so it doesn't, in their words, get out of control.
Well, the mechanism they're relying on is extreme compartmentalization.
Okay, what does that look like in practice?
So a Board of Trade and Investment isn't about solving human rights disputes, right? It's not about territorial claims.
Right, just business.
Exactly. It's a highly technical, bureaucratic structure designed to create a predictable framework for businesses. It's about establishing rules of the road for tariffs, intellectual property disputes, corporate market access.
So keeping the money flowing despite the tension.
Right. The underlying logic is that if you weave the two economies tightly enough together through these bureaucratic boards, the economic cost of a military or diplomatic rupture becomes so mutually catastrophic that both sides are just forced to maintain stability.
So it's basically mutual economic hostage-taking.
That's a pretty blunt way to put it, but mechanically, yes.
Wow.
And you see this compartmentalization play out perfectly in the cooperative elements mentioned in the transcript. Like It highlights progress, though it admits it's a difficult work in progress on stopping the flow of fentanyl precursors.
Okay, let's actually pause on that because the term fentanyl precursors gets thrown around a lot, and I think the distinction is crucial for you, the listener, to understand.
Definitely.
Because if you're listening and wondering, why doesn't the U.S. just demand China stop shipping fentanyl? The answer really comes down to the mechanics of global chemical supply chains.
Yeah, China isn't generally exporting the finished illicit drug fentanyl.
Exactly. What they are producing and exporting are the precursors, these raw, dual-use industrial chemicals that are completely legal. They're used in perfectly normal manufacturing globally.
Right. It's only when those raw chemicals are purchased, often by cartels in Mexico, that they are synthesized into illicit fentanyl.
Which is what makes managing this so incredibly complex from a diplomatic standpoint.
Yeah, because the U.S. isn't asking China to shut down illegal drug labs. They are asking the Chinese government to impose massive, invasive regulations on their own legitimate, multi-billion-dollar chemical manufacturing sector.
Just to track where these totally legal chemicals end up.
Exactly. And that requires a massive amount of intelligence sharing and law enforcement cooperation. The text mentions that law enforcement visits are actually happening to the two countries to address this.
But that requires a baseline of trust.
It does.
And how can that trust exist when, literally on the same day, you have intense escalatory military friction happening in the South China Sea?
Yeah, the juxtaposition is wild.
Right. The text specifically highlights China's Coast Guard conducting aggressive patrols near Taiwan and engaging in physical clashes with the Philippines. This isn't just a diplomatic disagreement. This is ramming vessels in open water.
Yeah, and this is where we get into the mechanics of what defense analysts call gray zone tactics, which the text indirectly touches on. Notice that the transcript specifically points to China's Coast Guard, not the People's Liberation Army Navy.
Right. They're using white-painted ships, not gray-painted warships.
Exactly. And there is a very specific strategic reason for that.
Which is?
Well, under international law, if a Chinese naval warship fires upon or rams a Philippine naval vessel, that is an unambiguous act of war.
And that would instantly trigger the mutual defense treaty the Philippines has with the United States.
Precisely. That would force the U.S. into a direct kinetic conflict with China, the exact scenario both sides are desperately trying to avoid.
Wow. So by using heavily armed Coast Guard vessels, which are technically civilian law enforcement, to harass Philippine resupply missions, China is operating in a gray zone.
Yes, they are forcefully asserting their territorial claims without crossing that strict legal threshold that would trigger American military intervention.
So they are just exploiting a loophole in international treaty law. They are pushing the envelope right up to the absolute microscopic edge of war, while simultaneously sending law enforcement officials to Washington to talk about chemical regulations and trade boards.
It's intense, and the U.S. is playing the exact same compartmentalized game in reverse.
Yeah,
The text emphasizes that the philosophy driving American strategy here is that a total rupture with China would have a dramatic global impact.
Yeah.
It's seen as totally reckless to sever ties completely. So, you condemn the Coast Guard clashes aggressively, you reaffirm your defense treaties in the Pacific, and then you sit down at the table and negotiate agricultural exports.
It takes an incredible amount of institutional discipline to maintain that separation, but okay, here is the most fascinating detail from the source material regarding this superpower dynamic, and it completely subverts the idea that the U.S. and China are at odds on every square inch of the globe.
Oh, the Strait of Hormuz.
Yes. The text reveals that China actually actively aligns with the U.S. position regarding the Strait of Hormuz in the Middle East.
Yeah, it's a surprising detail.
The transcript explicitly notes that China has publicly opposed any attempt by Iran to impose tolling or restrict freedom of navigation in that specific waterway.
And this is a perfect example of how pragmatic foreign policy truly is. Because there is zero ideological alignment between Washington and Beijing regarding Iran.
None at all.
But the mechanical reality of the global economy forces their interests into perfect alignment here. China is the manufacturing floor of the world. They are fundamentally reliant on importing massive amounts of energy to run their factories, and then exporting massive amounts of finished goods on container ships.
And the text points out that 20% of all global oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz.
Precisely. If that strait is closed, or even if shipping insurance rates just skyrocket because of the threat of attack, the Chinese economy suffers immediate severe damage.
So, in this one highly specific geographic choke point, the world's two biggest rivals find themselves essentially on the same team, advocating for the exact same thing:
Huh.
open waterways and freedom of navigation.
Which provides a really stark pivot to the actor who is currently threatening that exact freedom of navigation.
Right. The entity that has forced the U.S. to drop the diplomatic compartmentalization and take direct, kinetic military action. We are talking about Iran.
Yeah, because while the U.S. is trying to manage the geopolitical competition with China through, trade boards, the transcript details a much more visceral, immediate conflict playing out in the Middle East.
The source material paints a pretty grim picture of an active military engagement. It details ongoing U.S. strikes, specifically designed to degrade Iran's capability to target global commercial shipping.
And what is truly baffling is the diplomatic precursor to this violence.
Oh, the broken MOU.
Yes, the text highlights a broken memorandum of understanding in MOU. According to the transcript, Iran allegedly agreed, in writing, to ensure safe navigation in the strait.
The text says they were literally supposed to issue a public statement confirming this agreement. And instead of putting out the press release on that exact day, they blew up a commercial ship.
It's wild.
Yeah.
Let's unpack the logic of an MOU because it often confuses observers. An MOU is not a binding international treaty. It is a formalized expression of intent.
Right, so why would Iran sign an MOU and then immediately violate it with a kinetic attack?
The strategy, as analyzed by international relations experts, is often about testing boundaries and demonstrating unpredictability.
Okay.
By agreeing to a diplomatic framework and then instantly shattering it violently, Iran signals to the region and to the U.S. that they hold the ultimate leverage over the waterway and that paper agreements will not constrain their physical capabilities.
But that raises a massive question about the U.S. strategy. I mean, if you know you are dealing with a hostile actor who uses unpredictability as a weapon, why did the U.S. engage in this MOU in the first place?
Right.
A reporter in the transcript actually presses the secretary on this, asking if the very act of signing an agreement with Iran inherently acknowledges that Iran possesses some legitimate authority or sovereign power to regulate that international waterway.
It's a critical question of legal precedent. Like, if you negotiate with a hostage taker, do you legitimize hostage taking? The secretary's response in the text is a masterclass in the ruthless pragmatism of international law. He clarifies that the U.S. never at any point acknowledged Iranian authority or sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz.
The waterway remains international.
Exactly. The MOU did not grant Iran the legal right to regulate shipping.
So what were they actually agreeing to?
They were acknowledging physical reality. The U.S. acknowledged that Iran physically possessed weapons, missiles, and drones capable of reaching the ships.
Wow, okay.
The agreement was a purely mechanical transaction. We acknowledge you hold the weapon, and you agree to stop firing it at unarmed commercial vessels.
So it's basically an extortion negotiation. We aren't conceding that you own the highway. We are simply negotiating the terms under which you will stop throwing explosives at the passing trucks.
That is exactly the administration's framing. And understanding that framing is crucial to understanding the core strategic theory presented in the source material regarding Iran's long-term military ambitions.
Yes, the conventional shield.
Right. The text introduces the concept of the conventional shield.
This is where the strategy gets incredibly complex. Walk us through how this shield works mechanically.
Sure. The argument laid out in the transcript is that for the last 20 years, Iran has fundamentally altered its military strategy.
Okay.
Instead of trying to build a traditional, balanced military force with massive tank battalions and a traditional air force, they have systematically invested their national wealth into an asymmetric strategy, developing tens of thousands of cheap, highly effective drones and ballistic missiles.
The exact same drones and missiles they're using right now to terrorize shipping lanes.
Yes, but the text asserts that the ultimate strategic goal of these weapons was never just regional harassment. The grand strategy was to create a dense, overwhelming conventional shield.
So just an absolute swarm of weapons.
Exactly. The logic is that if Iran possesses enough missiles to overwhelm any regional air defense system, they effectively grant themselves immunity from invasion or massive retaliatory strikes.
Because the cost of attacking them becomes too high for anyone to stomach.
Exactly. And once that impenetrable shield of conventional weapons is in place, the theory states that Iran could then safely pursue its ultimate objective behind closed doors, a full-scale, weapons-grade nuclear program.
Oh, wow.
So if the international community say, The U.S. or Israel detects that Iran is weeks away from building a nuclear bomb and decides they must intervene militarily to stop it, Iran simply points to the conventional shield.
They threaten to unleash tens of thousands of missiles on oil refineries, commercial ports, and allied military bases across the entire Middle East.
Right. The conventional shield is designed to hold the global economy hostage to prevent anyone from stopping their nuclear breakout.
It's an incredibly dark, brilliant strategy. It's like a medieval kingdom deciding not to build an army, but instead spending 20 years building a massive, heavily fortified, completely impenetrable moat around their castle.
I love that analogy.
And the only reason they built the moat is so they can safely construct a doomsday device inside the courtyard without anyone being able to cross the water to stop them.
That's a very accurate visualization of the strategic mechanics at play. But the source material is very careful to highlight the severe hidden cost of building that moat.
Right.
It explicitly states that this 20-year obsession with building the conventional shield came at the direct, devastating expense of the Iranian domestic economy and the Iranian people.
How exactly does that economic devastation manifest, according to the text?
Well, the transcript points to severe, pre-existing economic conditions that have only worsened. Massive hyperinflation, skyrocketing food costs, and a collapsing currency.
Which makes sense. When a state diverts the majority of its hard currency and industrial capacity away from civilian infrastructure and toward producing single-use munitions, the internal economy hollows out.
Exactly. And the text notes that the Iranian public isn't fully aware of the scale of this misallocation of funds because the regime heavily suppresses a free press.
And now, according to the text, the irony is that this shield they sacrificed their economy to build is being actively dismantled.
Yeah, the transcript notes that Iran's military infrastructure has recently suffered tremendous damage due to U.S. strikes.
So the conventional shield is being degraded before it can fully serve its ultimate purpose of protecting a nuclear breakout.
Furthermore, the text details how Iran's resources aren't just spent internally on weapons. They are funneled outward to project power through deniability.
Okay, the proxy groups.
Yes. The transcript details how Iran uses its strained funds to sponsor a massive network of regional proxy groups.
This is a crucial mechanic to understand. Why does Iran use proxies instead of its own military?
Because proxies offer strategic depth and plausible deniability.
Right.
If Iran attacks a U.S. ship directly under its own flag, it invites a direct, massive U.S. declaration of war. But if they arm and fund a proxy group to do it, it muddies the waters of international law and retaliation.
And the text explicitly names these proxy nodes, right? The Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and various militias in Iraq.
It does.
And the transcript mentions a logistical detail that really underscores how deeply integrated Iran is with these proxies. It references direct flights from Tehran, the capital of Iran, straight into Yemen, carrying elements of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps.
Yeah, and for context, the IRGC is not a traditional national army.
They're more specialized.
They are a highly specialized, ideologically driven paramilitary force whose primary directives are protecting the regime internally and exporting the revolution externally.
So the fact that the text notes IRGC elements flying directly into Yemen to assist the Houthis highlights that these aren't just loosely affiliated rebel groups.
No, they are deeply integrated extensions of Iranian military logistics.
And because this interconnected web of Iranian proxies directly threatens that 20% of global oil passing through the strait, the U.S. strategy is shifting.
Right. The text outlines that the U.S. is aggressively pushing its allies to step up.
They are specifically encouraging countries like those Asian allies who heavily rely on the energy passing through the strait to contribute naval assets. They aren't just asking for money, they are asking for highly specialized military capabilities, like advanced mine-clearing vessels.
The underlying message from Washington is clear. The U.S. cannot permanently bear the entire financial and military burden of policing the global commons.
The strain on U.S. resources is simply too massive.
Exactly.
Which makes perfect sense when you realize that while the U.S. is trying to untangle this proxy warfare in the Middle East, they are simultaneously forced to manage a completely separate, even more dangerous dynamic with the other major nuclear power on the global chessboard.
Yeah, we have to pivot our focus from the warm waters of the Persian Gulf to the frozen trenches of Eastern Europe.
So the source material shifts its focus to Russia, specifically framed around an upcoming, highly anticipated meeting with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov.
And the text does not sugarcoat the reality of this relationship.
Not at all.
It acknowledges upfront that the ongoing massive war in Ukraine has fundamentally jammed the gears of diplomacy. The conflict has severely impeded the ability of the U.S. and Russia to find agreements on almost any other bilateral topic.
It's an almost impossible environment for diplomacy. I mean, the U.S. is providing tens of billions of dollars in weapons to Ukraine, specifically to destroy the Russian military, and yet the secretary is still planning to sit in a room with the Russian foreign minister.
Yeah.
Why? What is the mechanical logic of maintaining that dialogue?
Well, the transcript reveals a strategic hope that new conditions might eventually emerge that would allow the U.S. to play a constructive role in ending the conflict.
Okay.
But the deeper structural rationale for why the U.S. insists on talking to Russia, regardless of the bloodshed in Ukraine, relies on a historical precedent explicitly referenced by the Secretary in the text.
The Cold War.
The Cold War. He draws a direct line between the standoff with the Soviet Union and the current dynamic with Russia. Exactly. The Secretary points out that even at the absolute terrifying height of the Cold War, during crises where the world was literally hours away from nuclear annihilation, the United States and the Soviet Union never completely severed communication.
They had the red telephone.
Right. They maintained military-to-military deconfliction lines, and they maintained high-level diplomatic back channels.
Because the alternative is just guessing what the other side with a nuclear arsenal is doing.
Precisely. The philosophy driving this, as stated in the text, is that it is fundamentally reckless and irresponsible for the two largest nuclear-armed nations on the planet to simply stop talking.
Right.
When you sever communication, you rely entirely on assumptions and satellite imagery. A radar glitch or a misconstrued troop movement can quickly escalate into a nuclear exchange simply because neither side can pick up a phone to clarify their intent.
The stakes of radio silence are existential.
They really are.
That makes logical sense, but the reality of executing it must be incredibly jarring. Like, you are aggressively working to collapse their economy with sanctions and degrade their military on the battlefield, but you still have to meet them at summits to ensure the guardrails of nuclear deterrence are intact.
It's a massive balancing act.
And speaking of nuclear deterrence, this brings up what is arguably the most complex, far-reaching concept in this entire transcript, the evolution of the tri-party arms control dilemma.
This is where we need to dive deep into the game theory of modern global security.
Let's do it.
For the entire latter half of the 20th century, nuclear arms control was a bilateral game.
Right.
It was a seesaw with the U.S. on one side and Russia on the other. They sat across a table, counted each other's warheads, and negotiated treaties like START to keep the seesaw balanced.
But the text argues that this two-player model is now obsolete.
Completely obsolete.
Oh.
Any modern 21st century arms restriction agreement is fundamentally flawed and structurally unstable if it does not explicitly include China.
Because China is no longer just a regional player, they are rapidly, massively expanding their own nuclear capabilities.
Yes, they're building new silo fields, developing advanced delivery systems, and growing their stockpile at an unprecedented rate.
Right.
However, the text anticipates China's historical counter-argument to joining these treaties.
Which is?
For decades, China's stance has been, our nuclear arsenal is a tiny fraction of the size of the U.S. and Russian arsenals. We are purely defensive. It is hypocritical for you to demand we cap our weapons when you possess thousands more.
Okay, that makes sense from their perspective.
We will only join trilateral arms control negotiations once our stockpile reaches numerical parity with yours.
So essentially, we won't sit down at the poker table until you let us buy in for the exact same amount of chips you already have.
Exactly. But the U.S. position, as outlined in the transcript, rejects that logic.
How so?
The U.S. argues that given the sheer velocity of China's nuclear expansion and their growing geopolitical ambitions, the world cannot afford to wait a decade for China to reach parity before establishing rules.
So the structural integrity of global deterrence requires a tri-party framework, U.S., Russia, and China, to be negotiated from the outset.
Right.
I want to really unpack the mechanics of this because I don't think people realize how completely a third player breaks the math of nuclear deterrence.
It shatters it.
For decades, we relied on amity, mutually assured destruction. It's a binary system. If the U.S. shoots at Russia, Russia shoots back, and both are completely destroyed.
Right.
The game theory dictates that because the outcome is mutual suicide, no rational actor will ever take the first shot. The standoff is terrifying, but statistically, it is highly stable.
It's stable because the retaliation is guaranteed and singular.
Exactly.
But as soon as you introduce a third peer-level nuclear power into that equation, the mathematical stability of mutually assured destruction completely collapses. It becomes what game theorists call A three-way Mexican standoff.
Or a
Cruel.
Right. Because in a three-player game, if player A, say, the U.S. gets into a conflict and launches a nuclear strike against player B, Russia, player A, and player B annihilate each other.
Right.
But player C, China, simply sits back, watches their two biggest rivals destroy themselves, and emerges completely unharmed as the sole, undisputed superpower on a ruined Earth.
And that fundamentally alters the incentive structures for every single player.
How?
Well, if you are the U.S. or Russia, you suddenly become terrified of engaging the other, not just because of retaliation, but because you know fighting leaves you vulnerable to China.
Oh, wow.
Conversely, does China feel emboldened to act more aggressively in the Pacific, knowing that the U.S. is terrified of depleting its resources in a conflict that leaves Russia intact?
It creates a massive incentive for backroom alliances. Two players will always want to secretly ally to gang up on the third. The paranoia just becomes exponential.
Which is precisely why the transcript argues so forcefully that a tri-party arms control agreement is not just a diplomatic preference, it is a mathematical necessity for survival in the 21st century.
The old bilateral treaties just cannot manage the complex, chaotic incentives of a three-player nuclear environment.
No, they can't.
It is terrifying to think about the sheer bureaucratic and intellectual weight required to manage that transition. And what makes it even more difficult is that the distinct lines between these adversaries are beginning to blur.
Yeah, that's a key point.
I want to highlight a highly specific detail from the text that perfectly illustrates this. A reporter mentions that the president suggested adding Iran to a piece of legislation that was originally designed as a Russia Sanctions Act.
Yes, the reporter astutely asks if this legislative maneuver is an official U.S. acknowledgement of a growing, formalized military alliance between Moscow and Tehran.
And the secretary's response in the text is fascinatingly mundane. He brushes off the grand geopolitical implications and essentially says, no, it's just a matter of legislative convenience. The Russia sanctions bill is a vehicle that's already moving quickly through Congress. Tacking Iran onto it just gives the president faster authority to impose economic costs on them.
It's a brilliant example of the gap between grand strategy and bureaucratic mechanics.
Right.
On paper, it looks like a unified theory of global conflict, merging the European theater with the Middle Eastern theater. But in reality, as the text explains, it's just the State Department exploiting a loophole in congressional procedure to get sanctions passed faster.
But regardless of the intent, the effect is that the lines are blurring. You have distinct adversaries, a global rival in Russia, and a regional disruptor in Iran, and yet the economic and legal tools the U.S. is using to combat them are becoming unified.
Yeah.
We are literally using laws designed to punish Moscow to squeeze Tehran. The chessboard is shrinking.
It is shrinking, and the interconnectedness is compounding. And while the U.S. focuses so much energy and resources on this macro-level management of nuclear giants in Europe and Asia, the source material forcefully reminds us that the U.S. is simultaneously fighting a deeply entrenched, deeply ideological struggle right in its own backyard.
Which brings us to the hemisphere's oldest ongoing geopolitical conflict, Cuba.
Yeah.
The text transitions into this topic based on a recently declassified U.S. government report regarding Cuban and, more broadly, communist interference operations occurring inside the United States.
And the picture the transcript paints of modern Cuba is absolutely catastrophic.
It doesn't just call it an adversary, it describes it as a failed state.
Yes.
The most staggering statistic presented in the text is the claim that Cuba has lost 10 to 15% of its entire population just since the year 2021 due to severe economic mismanagement.
A demographic collapse of 10 to 15% in just a few years is almost unheard of outside of an active kinetic war zone.
It's mind-boggling.
When a nation loses that percentage of its population, it is almost entirely the young, educated, working-age demographic that flees. You are experiencing a massive brain drain and a hollowing out of the labor force, which creates a death spiral for the domestic economy.
The text breaks down the core of this collapse into two intersecting crises facing the Cuban regime. First, it asserts that the underlying economic model of the country is fundamentally backwards.
Right.
It claims that the specific brand of centrally planned economy utilized by Havana exists literally nowhere else in the world anymore, and it simply cannot generate organic growth or sustain its populace.
But an economy can limp along in a dysfunctional state for decades if it has external support.
Sure.
Which brings us to the second and more immediate crisis detailed in the transcript, The sudden, catastrophic removal of Cuba's external economic life support system.
Oh, the oil.
Yes. For years, the Cuban regime relied heavily on deeply subsidized, essentially free oil shipments from Venezuela.
Now, this is a fascinating mechanic of global shadow economics that the text reveals. Because when people hear that Cuba was receiving subsidized oil from Venezuela, the natural assumption is that Cuba was burning that oil in their own power plants to keep the lights on in Havana.
But they weren't.
Exactly. The transcript explicitly states that Cuba wasn't consuming all of that oil. They were taking roughly 60% of those Venezuelan oil shipments and immediately reselling them on the open market for hard cash.
It's vital to unpack how this actually works, because a heavily sanctioned state like Cuba cannot simply list oil on a public commodities exchange.
Right. How do you even do that?
This involves a massive, complex arbitrage scheme. Venezuela, under its own heavy sanctions and mismanagement, produces crude oil but struggles to sell it. They agree to transfer massive quantities to Cuba at a fraction of the market price, often in exchange for Cuba sending doctors or security personnel to Caracas.
So it's a barter system?
Initially, yes.
Mm-hmm.
But Cuba doesn't need all that crude. So how do they sell it? They utilize the global shadow fleet or phantom fleet.
Oh, what?
These are aging oil tankers that operate outside of standard maritime regulations. A Cuban-flagged vessel might meet a shadow tanker in the middle of the ocean.
Out in international waters.
Right. They turn off their AIS, their automatic tracking transponders, and conduct a ship-to-ship transfer of millions of barrels of crude oil in the dark.
That is wild.
That shadow tanker then sails to a buyer, perhaps in Asia, masking the origin of the oil. The buyer pays for the oil, likely at a discount, but still vastly more than Cuba paid Venezuela for it. And that hard currency is funneled back to the regime in Havana through shell companies and complex international banking maneuvers.
It is literally a massive state-sponsored money laundering operation using crude oil as the currency.
Exactly.
The Cuban regime was essentially acting as a middleman broker for sanctioned Venezuelan oil. It's like a trust fund business.
What do you mean?
Like, the Cuban domestic economy never actually turned a profit, but the regime survived for decades because a wealthy benefactor, first the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and then Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, just kept writing massive checks to cover the operating losses.
That analogy perfectly captures the structural vulnerability described in the text. But the transcript points out that the benefactor is now broke.
Right.
Venezuela's own oil industry has largely collapsed due to mismanagement and sanctions. The free oil is dried up, the arbitrage scheme is halted, and the Cuban regime is suddenly fully exposed to the reality of its own broken internal economic engine.
But this intense focus on the economic collapse of Cuba brings up a perceived ideological inconsistency in U.S. foreign policy, which a reporter actively challenges the secretary on during the briefing.
It's a very sharp journalistic question.
It really is. The reporter essentially asks, how can the United States use such blunt, aggressive, anti-communist rhetoric and maintain crippling sanctions against a small island nation like Cuba, while simultaneously rolling out the red carpet in Washington to negotiate trade boards with China, which is governed by the largest, most powerful communist party on the planet?
It appears hypocritical on its face.
Right. Why does the U.S. try to bankrupt communism in the Caribbean while actively trying to manage supply chains with communism in Asia?
The administration's defense, as articulated in the text, rests on a strict distinction between international competition and domestic interference.
Okay, unpack that.
The secretary argues that the core issue with the Cuban regime, which was the specific focus of the recently declassified intelligence report, is their historical, ongoing, and highly sophisticated effort to actively drive wedges and interfere inside American society and the American political system.
The transcript explicitly refers to the Cuban intelligence apparatus as an intellectual author of these types of domestic interference campaigns throughout the hemisphere. So the logic being that while the U.S. strongly opposes China's system of government and competes with them aggressively on the global stage, they view Cuba's actions as a direct, covert attack on the internal stability of the U.S. homeland.
Yes.
It's kind of like the difference between fiercely competing with a rival corporation across town versus discovering that the rival corporation has been actively sneaking into your headquarters at night to sabotage your internal servers and turn your employees against each other.
That is precisely the administration's stated rationale for the differing approaches. However, despite this incredibly harsh rhetoric and the designation of Cuba as a hostile failed state, The source material introduces a fascinating, highly complex detail regarding humanitarian aid.
Oh, yeah.
The text explicitly mentions that the United States is currently in the process of shipping over $100 million in humanitarian assistance to Cuba.
Wait, walk me through exactly how that works. You just established that the U.S. views the Cuban regime as an active threat conducting intelligence operations inside America. Why on earth is the U.S. government sending them $100 million?
They aren't sending it to the regime.
Okay.
The text includes a massive, critical caveat. It specifies that this $100 million in aid is designed to bypass the Cuban government entirely. It is being distributed exclusively by non-governmental organizations, NGOs operating on the ground.
But how do you practically bypass a totalitarian regime in their own country?
It requires an incredibly delicate logistical dance. You don't hand the regime a check.
Right.
You procure physical goods, food, medicine, agricultural supplies, and you ship them to independent humanitarian groups, religious organizations, or independent farmers.
So you cut the government completely out of the loop.
Exactly. The goal is to alleviate the suffering of the Cuban people without allowing the regime to touch the resources or use the aid as a tool for political patronage.
And the transcript asserts a very dark view of how the Cuban government reacts to this kind of independent aid. It claims that the regime actually fears economic prosperity among its citizens.
Yes, the logic presented in the text is that for a centralized authoritarian system to survive, the populace must remain entirely dependent on the state for their basic survival.
Right. If you don't rely on the state, they lose power.
Exactly. If citizens gain independent access to food, medicine, and capital through NGOs, they gain economic liberty. And the text argues that the regime believes economic liberty inevitably leads to a demand for political liberty, which would result in a loss of control.
Therefore, the regime prefers a state of managed, controlled poverty over independent prosperity.
Which is a devastating assessment of the human cost of these geopolitical struggles.
It really is. So let's take a breath and look at the sheer scale of the chessboard we've mapped out so far, based purely on this one transcript.
It's massive.
The United States is attempting to strategically deter China in the Pacific while simultaneously negotiating intricate trade deals with them. They are trying to maintain diplomatic guardrails with Russia regarding Ukraine while completely rewriting the game theory of nuclear arms control.
Right.
They are actively bombing Iranian proxy targets to protect international shipping lanes. And they are orchestrating a massive shadow logistics operation to send NGO aid into a collapsing Cuban state just 90 miles from Florida.
Executing even one of these policies would define an era of foreign policy.
Yeah.
Executing all of them simultaneously requires an unimaginably vast, highly coordinated bureaucratic engine.
But according to the source material, the U.S. government is currently in the middle of actively trying to change exactly how that engine is built.
Right. This transitions us from the grand strategy of foreign policy down into the gritty operational mechanics.
Let's get into the weeds.
The text spends a significant amount of time detailing how the bureaucracy itself is being structured, focusing heavily on the National Security Council, or the NSC. The transcript details a very specific philosophy driving a restructuring effort aimed at significantly shrinking the NSC. It notes a shift away from a bloated model of 300 to 400 personnel, moving towards a much leaner, tightly focused organization.
I have to admit, my initial reaction to reading that was just total confusion.
Why is that?
Because if we just spent 40 minutes discussing how the world is getting exponentially more complicated, more interconnected, and more dangerous, why on earth would you shrink the brain trust? Don't you need more analysts, more experts, and more personnel to manage these overlapping crises?
It seems counterintuitive, but the argument presented in the text isn't about eliminating expertise. It's about relocating it to its proper institutional home.
Okay, explain that.
The philosophy driving the restructure is that deep, granular subject matter expertise shouldn't be housed within the White House via the NSC.
Where should it be?
That expertise already exists and should remain within the individual executive agencies. The State Department for Diplomacy, the Treasury Department for Economic Sanctions, the Department of Energy for Nuclear Issues, the intelligence community, and what the text somewhat colloquially refers to as the Department of War, meaning the Defense Department.
So if the massive federal agencies are the ones supposed to be housing the thousands of experts and generating the policy ideas, what is the actual function of the National Security Council?
According to the transcript, the NSC's sole defining job is coordination.
Okay.
It exists strictly to manage the complex interagency process. When a crisis occurs, the NSC's role is to pull the diplomatic analysis from state, the military options from defense, and the economic impacts from Treasury. Synthesize that competing information, present a coherent menu of options to the president, and then ruthlessly execute the president's final decision across the government.
Got it.
The argument is that when the NSC grows to 400 people, it stops being a nimble coordinator and morphs into its own massive bureaucracy, actively competing with the agencies for influence rather than directing them.
It's like an orchestra.
How so?
Like the State Department is the string section, the Defense Department is the brass, Treasury is percussion. You don't need 300 conductors standing on the podium, bumping into each other, trying to lean over and play the violins themselves.
That's a great way to look at it.
You just need a small, highly efficient team of conductors whose only job is to stand at the center and ensure all those vastly different sections are playing the exact same symphony at the tempo the president demands.
That's a good starting point.
Right.
But the reality described in the text is actually much messier than that.
Of course it is.
It's an orchestra where the brass section has entirely different sheet music than the strings, and half the woodwinds believe the percussion section shouldn't even be in the building. The friction between the Pentagon, the State Department, and the intelligence agencies is legendary. They have different cultures, different budgets, and often completely contradictory priorities. The NSC's job is forcing them to play the same symphony, despite that massive internal friction.
And we actually see exactly how that internal friction plays out in the real world when the text discusses the delay in a second major arms sale to Taiwan.
Yes, that's a perfect example.
A reporter asks a very pointed question. Why is a massive weapons sale to Taiwan a sale that has already been informally approved by Congress and is clearly a strategic priority to deter China, currently stalled under an internal review process at the State Department?
And the answer the secretary provides reveals that foreign policy is rarely just about political willpower or grand strategy. It is heavily, sometimes entirely, constrained by physical logistics and supply chains.
Right. You can't just hit add to cart and overnight a shipment of Patriot missiles to Taipei. Walk us through the actual logistics of this delay.
The text unpacks the complex interagency balancing act required before the U.S. can finalize a transfer of highly advanced weaponry.
Okay.
The State Department can't just sign off on the geopolitical implications. They have to coordinate with the Defense Department to run the physical numbers. First, they have to assess the U.S. military's own domestic stockpiles.
Right, checking the inventory.
Exactly. If we send these missiles to Taiwan, do we have enough left in our own bunkers to fight a two-front war if necessary?
And if the answer is no, they have to look at the factories.
Exactly. They have to evaluate the current real-time capacity of the U.S. defense industrial base. The transcript explicitly notes that there is a massive ongoing effort to restart and expand this industrial base, but you cannot build a complex missile assembly line overnight.
It requires highly specialized labor, rare earth minerals, intricate microchips.
Right.
And the complexity compounds because Taiwan isn't the only country in line. The text explicitly mentions that the U.S. is simultaneously making extensive, ongoing sales and direct military transfers to Ukraine. You have a finite manufacturing capacity. You cannot promise the exact same artillery shell or the exact same air defense interceptor to Ukraine, Taiwan, and the U.S. military if the factory only has the physical capacity to build a limited number per month.
It becomes a terrifyingly high-stakes inventory management problem.
The bureaucracy is stalled because they are literally trying to map out global supply chains for weapons of war.
And amidst all of this incredibly dense structural analysis, the nuclear game theory, the defense supply chains, the interagency friction, the text reveals a deeply human, incredibly delicate juxtaposition that highlights the strangest paradox of foreign policy.
What's that?
Well, despite the intense active hostilities we discussed earlier between the U.S. and Iran, where we are actively bombing their proxies and they are attacking global shipping, the transcript notes that the U.S. government recently secured the release of an American wrongfully detained in Iran.
It is truly wild to think about the mechanics of that. Like, you have U.S. Central Command ordering airstrikes against Iranian-funded militants in Yemen and Iraq. You have the Treasury Department tightening financial sanctions to crush the Iranian economy.
Right.
And yet, simultaneously, a discreet, highly compartmentalized diplomatic backchannel managed to survive amidst all that warfare to negotiate the release of a single human being.
The transcript treats this release as a profound success, though it soberly notes that given the broader geopolitical climate, It is obviously not the most productive moment for such delicate
Yeah,
negotiations.
I'd imagine not.
But it highlights the absolute necessity of maintaining those back channels we discussed earlier. If you sever all communication during a conflict, you lose the ability to negotiate these hostage releases.
And this isn't an isolated, resolved issue either. The text emphasizes that the administration is currently navigating a web of ongoing detainee cases across the globe. It mentions Reza Valazada, who is still detained in Iran, and it specifically names two individuals detained in China, Chen Yulin and Min Zin.
And the case of Minzin, as detailed in the transcript, is particularly illustrative of the bureaucratic hurdles involved in these situations.
How so?
The text notes that Minzin is a researcher who was detained by authorities in China's Yunnan province while he was conducting research related to Myanmar.
Okay.
However, the secretary confirms in the briefing that his case is still actively working its way through the official State Department review process, and he has not yet been officially legally classified under the designation of wrongfully detained.
Wait, why does that specific legal classification matter so much? Why can't the government just immediately demand his release?
Because that specific legal designation triggers a massive shift in how the U.S. government handles the case.
Oh, interesting.
Once someone is officially classified as wrongfully detained under the Levinson Act, their case is transferred out of normal consular affairs and handed over to the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs.
So it unlocks completely different tools.
Exactly. It unlocks entirely new sets of diplomatic tools, resources, and negotiation strategies. But determining the classification requires a rigorous, often agonizingly slow internal review to ensure the detention meets strict legal criteria of being politically motivated or fundamentally unjust, rather than a legitimate law enforcement action by a foreign government.
So it is a slow, methodical bureaucracy operating behind the scenes of highly emotional, time-sensitive crises.
It really is.
It's a stark reminder that behind every grand geopolitical strategy, there are individual human lives caught in the gears.
Yeah.
Now, as we approach the end of this briefing, the transcript features a sort of rapid-fire round where reporters throw a dizzying array of vastly different policy questions at the secretary. I don't want to just gloss over these because I think fully fleshing them out demonstrates the sheer overwhelming breadth of what this interagency process has to handle on any given Tuesday morning.
It really is a relentless barrage of distinct regional issues. Let's look at the exchange regarding Syria. A reporter asks about the current U.S. posture toward the Assad regime. The text notes that the U.S. is strongly encouraging Syria to focus its resources internally on nation building and specifically on combating the remnants of ISIS within its borders.
But the subtext there is deeply connected to what we discussed about Iran.
Right.
The U.S. isn't just offering friendly nation-building advice. They are trying to sever a logistical pipeline. The transcript points out the U.S. imperative is to stop Syrian territory from being utilized as a permissive launchpad and a logistical transit hub to support Hezbollah and destabilize neighboring Lebanon.
Yes.
The U.S. is essentially telling Syria, focus on your own domestic security and stop acting as a weapons highway for Iranian proxies.
Exactly. Every regional issue ties back to the broader strategic map.
Mm.
Then, in a completely different vein, there is a seemingly bizarre moment where a reporter asks if the U.S. government is intervening in the extradition challenge of the Tate brothers in Eastern Europe.
Which feels like it belongs in a completely different press briefing entirely.
It does. But the secretary's response is a crucial demonstration of institutional discipline. He delivers a firm, total detachment.
Okay.
He states that the U.S. views the situation as an entirely independent judicial process playing out within the sovereign courts of a foreign nation, and asserts there is absolutely no role for the U.S. executive branch or foreign policy apparatus to play in it.
Got it.
It's an exercise in publicly drawing boundaries around what the U.S. will and will not expend diplomatic capital on.
And finally, a brief but incredibly significant mention of Myanmar, also known as Burma. A reporter asks about the U.S. policy toward engaging with the ruling military junta, specifically regarding the extraction of rare earth minerals.
This is where the entire web connects back on itself.
Let's close the loop.
The text notes that the U.S. policy toward the junta is still being actively developed. They are trying to balance deep, historical human rights concerns regarding the military regime's abuses against the massive strategic need for critical minerals.
And why do we need those specific rare earth minerals from Myanmar? because they are the fundamental building blocks required for the microchips and guidance systems of the exact same advanced weaponry we are desperately trying to build in our defense industrial base to arm Taiwan and deter China.
It's all connected.
The human rights crisis in Southeast Asia directly impacts the supply chain for the missiles needed to stabilize the South China Sea. It never stops. The loop is entirely closed.
It is.
So what does this massive, deeply complicated chessboard actually mean for you, the listener? We've covered a tremendous amount of ground today, and it can feel abstract, like a game played by diplomats in closed rooms.
Well, if we synthesize everything we've mapped out today, the ultimate takeaway is that modern foreign policy is almost never about lofty, abstract ideals or simple moral binaries.
Yeah.
It is profoundly gritty, incredibly complex, and fundamentally tied to the mechanics of survival. It is about the tedious logistics of managing global supply chains.
Yeah.
It's about deploying multi-billion-dollar military assets to protect the 20% of global oil moving through the Strait of Hormuz, not for territorial conquest, but simply to prevent the global energy market from instantly collapsing.
Right.
It is about the terrifying, absolute necessity of ensuring that diplomatic back channels remain open with nuclear-armed rivals, even while you are actively engaged in proxy wars designed to degrade their military capabilities.
It is about the fact that the price of gas at your local pump, the availability of advanced microchips for your next electronic device, and the cost of the groceries on your table are directly, intimately tied to the freedom of navigation in waterways thousands of miles away that you may never even see. It is tied to the manufacturing capacity of a defense industrial base trying to simultaneously arm Ukraine and Taiwan. The policies, the negotiations, and the bureaucratic friction detailed in this transcript aren't just history. They are the unseen forces actively shaping your daily life.
They really are.
And I want to leave you with one final, provocative thought to mull over. A thought that builds directly on the game theory we unpacked today, but pushes it just a little further into the future.
Let's hear it.
We talked at length about the mathematical necessity of bringing China into a tri-party nuclear arms control agreement. We discussed how a three-player standoff, a truel, is inherently unstable because player A and player B might destroy each other, leaving player C as the sole survivor.
Right, the Mexican standoff.
But consider the chilling psychology of how that instability evolves as technology advances. We are no longer just dealing with intercontinental ballistic missiles that take 30 minutes to cross the globe, giving leaders time to pick up a red telephone.
That's a good point.
We are entering an era of hypersonic glide vehicles that can strike targets in minutes, and artificial intelligence systems integrated into early warning radars that can process threats faster than human cognition.
Oh, wow.
What happens to the already unstable math of a three-player nuclear standoff when the decision to launch or not launch is compressed from 30 minutes down to 3 minutes?
That is terrifying.
If an AI system detects an anomaly, and you are in a paranoid three-way rivalry where you know two players might secretly ally against you, do you trust the machine? Does the fear of being the one left behind force leaders to pre-delegate launch authority to algorithms?
That completely changes the game.
As we watch this tri-party dynamic emerge, as the weapons become exponentially faster and the bureaucracies desperately try to keep up, the challenge won't just be negotiating the treaties. The challenge will be ensuring that human judgment can survive the speed of the machines we've built to protect us. That is the question that will define the next century of foreign policy.
I think you're absolutely right.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the unseen forces shaping our world, keep looking at the blueprint, and we will catch you next time.